The sound of rotors slicing through morning mist was Susan Hartley's first act of revenge. At precisely 5:47 a.m., her custom-modified Bell 429 helicopter descended onto the meticulously hidden helipad behind her immaculate Tudor-style home in Pinewood Estates. The precision was deliberate. She knew exactly when the HOA's early morning patrol would be making its rounds, and this was her moment to make a statement. Susan wasn't just any homeowner. She was a retired strategic communications executive who had spent 27 years navigating corporate battlefields, and now the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association was about to learn that bureaucratic warfare was her true calling. The neighborhood might see her as Karen, a term she'd long since reclaimed as a badge of honor, but they had no idea what was coming. Last week's HOA board meeting had crossed a line. When Thomas Reginald Wheeler, i.e. the board president, had smugly declared that her carefully restored vintage Mercedes would be towed for violating community aesthetic standards, something inside Susan had shifted. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a piece of automotive history, a 1962 300 SL Roadster that had won concours competitions and was worth more than most of the board members' annual salaries combined. But it wasn't just about the car, it was about principle. The helicopters she owned, yes, plural, were part of her private collection, a passion cultivated during her years of global consulting. Each machine represented a different era of aviation technology, meticulously maintained and housed in a climate-controlled hangar that the HOA knew nothing about. Her property sprawled across 3 acres, strategically positioned to hide her most prized possessions from prying neighborhood eyes. As the helicopter's skids touched down, Susan allowed herself a small, calculated smile. The board had no idea they were about to engage with someone who had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts in boardrooms from Tokyo to London. Their petty regulations were nothing compared to the international diplomacy she'd mastered. Her phone buzzed, a text from her network of insider contacts within the HOA. "They're moving junk cars to block your main driveway at dawn. Thought you want to know." Susan's manicured fingers typed a swift response. Perfect timing. The junkyard cars were their first mistake. They assumed she was limited by ground transportation, that blocking her primary driveway would inconvenience her. They had no conception of the strategic advantage she was about to demonstrate. Her pilot, Marcus, a former military aviator she poached from a private security firm, was already running pre-flight checks. They'd planned this moment for weeks, ever since the HOA had started its campaign of increasingly ridiculous restrictions. Susan adjusted her Hermes silk scarf and checked her reflection in the helicopter's window. At 62, she looked closer to 50, with steel gray hair, cut, and precise bob and eyes that could negotiate a hostile takeover before most people had finished their morning coffee. The real game was about to begin, and Pinewood Estates would never see her coming. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for 10 a.m. sharp, just hours after Susan's helicopter demonstration. Thomas Wheeler's face had turned an impressive shade of puce by the time Susan walked into the community center's cramped conference room. Her channel blazer was immaculate, her posture military straight, a stark contrast to the disheveled board members scrambling through their documentation. "Mrs. Hartley," Wheeler began, his voice trembling with barely contained rage, "your flagrant violation of community bylaws, specifically Section 7, subsection C regarding aerial transportation, will not be tolerated." Susan raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Which specific bylaw would that be, Thomas? The one you're currently fabricating in your mind?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew Susan wasn't just another homeowner. Her reputation preceded her, a woman who had dismantled corporate legal teams before most of these board members had graduated college. Behind Wheeler, Janet Peterson, the board's secretary and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, shuffled through a thick binder of regulations. Janet had made it her personal mission to document every possible infraction, her bifocals perched precariously on the tip of her nose. "The property assessment clearly states," Janet began, her finger tracing a line of text. "The property assessment," Susan interrupted, "was conducted in 1998 and has not been updated to reflect modern transportation technologies. My helipad is fully permitted through county aviation regulations, installed with all necessary clearances." Wheeler's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He hadn't expected her to have documentation. No one ever came prepared like Susan did. The real conflict, however, wasn't about the helicopter. It was about the vintage Mercedes that threatened to tow. A car that represented more than just transportation. It was a piece of automotive history, carefully restored, a testament to Susan's meticulous nature. "About the Mercedes," she continued, pulling out a thick folder from her Louis Vuitton briefcase. "I have comprehensive documentation proving its historical significance. The car has won multiple concours competitions and is recognized by the Classic Car Club of America as a preservation class vehicle." Janet leaned forward, her glasses sliding down further. The other board members exchanged nervous glances. Susan Hartley wasn't just fighting. She was systematically dismantling their entire argument. What they didn't know was that Susan had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Her network of contacts, former colleagues, legal consultants, and aviation experts, had been meticulously gathering information, creating a fortress of documentation that would make their accusations crumble. The junkyard cars blocking her driveway, a tactical error. Susan had already arranged for their removal through a series of strategic phone calls to local authorities and talent companies. I suggest, Susan said, her voice as sharp as a scalpel, that we discuss the actual issues facing our community: the deteriorating sidewalks, the outdated community center, the lack of proper security measures. Wheeler's face shifted from anger to confusion. This wasn't the confrontation he had anticipated. Susan was playing a different game entirely, and she was several moves ahead. The aftermath of the board meeting spread through Pinewood Estates like wildfire. By noon, Susan's strategic maneuver had become neighborhood legend. Residents peered through their blinds, whispering about the woman who had single-handedly brought the HOA board to its knees. Her neighbor, Richard Martinez, a retired mathematics professor who had long been silently frustrated with the HOA's petty regulations, was the first to break ranks. "I'll bring the coffee," Richard said, appearing on Susan's perfectly manicured front lawn that afternoon. His wife Elena trailed behind him, carrying a tray of homemade empanadas, a peace offering and a show of solidarity. Susan's kitchen was a testament to her meticulous nature. Stainless steel appliances gleamed like surgical instruments, and a wall of carefully curated cookbooks suggested a woman who approached culinary arts with the same strategic precision she applied to everything else. "They've gone too far this time," Richard muttered, accepting a cup of single-origin Ethiopian pour-over coffee. "Those junkyard cars, completely illegal. I've been documenting HOA violations for years, but nobody ever listens." Susan knew exactly why. The HOA board had cultivated a culture of fear. Homeowners who spoke up found themselves buried in paperwork, facing ridiculous fines or dealing with mysteriously delayed maintenance requests. But Susan wasn't like other residents. She had spent decades dismantling corporate power structures. This was child's play. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, her helicopter pilot. "County Aviation Board confirmed. Your Helipad paperwork is pristine." Alina leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Thomas Wheeler's wife told my book club that he's been having night sweats since the board meeting. Said he can't sleep, keeps muttering something about the helicopter woman." Susan allowed herself a small, calculated smile. Psychological warfare had always been her specialty. The real battle, however, was just beginning. Wheeler and the board would retaliate, of that Susan was certain. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals were always most dangerous when they felt threatened. Her secure tablet displayed a series of encrypted emails, communications from her network of former colleagues and legal contacts. Each message was a potential weapon, carefully preserved for the right moment. "They don't understand," Susan said to Richard and Alina. "This isn't about a car or a helicopter. It's about power, about who gets to make the rules." Richard chuckled, a deep laugh that spoke of years of academic debate and quiet resistance. "And you intend to change those rules?" "Not change," Susan corrected, her steel-gray eyes reflecting a lifetime of strategic planning. "Dismantle." Outside, a landscaping crew arrived, not the HOA's usual cut-rate operation, but a team Susan had personally vetted. They moved with military precision, transforming her already immaculate yard into a botanical masterpiece. Another text came through, this one from an unexpected source, a junior board member who had witnessed the morning's confrontation. "We need to talk," the message read. "Not everyone agrees with Wheeler's approach." Susan set down her coffee cup. The first crack in the HOA's facade had just appeared. Barely 35, Michael had always felt like an outsider among the board's crusty old guard. His background in tech startups gave him a perspective that Wheeler and his cronies could never understand. When Susan's helicopter descended that morning, Michael saw something the others missed, a strategic genius who could potentially reshape the entire community. Their meeting place was deliberate, a small coffee shop 3 towns over, far from the watchful eyes of Pinewood Estates. Susan arrived in a nondescript BMW, her Channel blazer replaced by a simple cashmere sweater that still screamed old money sophistication. "They're planning something," Michael said without preamble, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Wheeler's not done. He's bringing in outside consultants, legal sharks who specialize in complex HOA disputes." Susan's fingers, adorned with a single understated diamond ring, flipped through the documents. Forensic lawyers from a firm in downtown Chicago, specialists in community association litigation. This wasn't a local skirmish anymore, it was becoming a full-scale war. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of steel. Michael explained how Wheeler had been secretly gathering support from board members who felt threatened by Susan's challenge. Janet Peterson had been documenting every possible infraction, building a case that would make Soviet-era bureaucrats proud. They were preparing a multi-pronged attack, challenges to her helipad permit, investigations into her property's zoning, even attempts to challenge the historical status of her vintage Mercedes. "They don't know about your full network, do they?" Michael asked. Susan's laugh was sharp and brief. "Networks are like chess pieces. The visible ones are rarely the most important." What Michael didn't know, what nobody in Pinewood Estates knew, was the depth of Susan's connections. Her years in strategic communications had built a web of influence that stretched far beyond this suburban battleground. Corporate executives, aviation regulators, legal experts, all were potential allies in her arsenal. The real game was just beginning. As they spoke, Susan's encrypted phone buzzed. A message from Richard Martinez, her unexpected ally from the neighborhood. The county assessor's office had just received an anonymous tip about some interesting discrepancies in the HOA's financial records. "Interesting timing," Susan murmured, showing Michael the message. The young board member looked nervous and excited. "You're not just fighting back, you're dismantling their entire system." Susan's response was measured. Systems are only as strong as their weakest link, and in Pinewood Estates, those links are about to break. Outside the coffee shop, a nondescript black SUV idled. Inside, two figures watched, one taking photos, the other making notes. The surveillance was amateur, predictable. Susan had been aware of their presence from the moment she parked her car. In the world of corporate and community warfare, information was the most powerful weapon, and Susan Hartley was an arsenal unto herself. The county assessor's office was a labyrinth of bureaucratic inefficiency, except when Susan Hartley walked through its doors. Files that would typically take weeks to process materialized within hours. Her reputation preceded her, a carefully cultivated network of connections that could slice through red tape like a surgeon's scalpel. By noon, the financial records of Pinewood Estates HOA were spread across a conference room table, each document marked with color-coded sticky notes that told a story of financial irregularities. Thomas Wheeler had no idea how completely his world was about to unravel. The first anomaly was small, a $1,200 maintenance contract for landscaping services that never seemed to match the actual work performed. But small discrepancies were like loose threads on an expensive sweater. Pull one and the entire fabric could unravel. Michael Chen arrived with additional documentation, his tech startup background giving him a forensic eye for digital trails. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of recurring payments. "These vendor invoices don't make sense. The accounting is deliberately obscured." Susan's fingers traced the columns of numbers. Each line was a potential weapon, each discrepancy a potential strike against the HOA board. Meanwhile, back in Pinewood Estates, a different battle was brewing. Richard Martinez had been quietly gathering support among other homeowners, sharing Susan's documented evidence of HOA mismanagement. The neighborhood was changing, the whispers growing louder. Belina Martinez hosted a neighborhood barbecue, ostensibly a casual gathering, but everyone knew its true purpose. Homeowners huddled in small groups, sharing stories of petty HOA violations of rules that seemed designed to control rather than improve the community. Susan's vintage Mercedes sat in her driveway, a symbol of resistance. The junkyard cars that had been moved to block her entrance were now a distant memory, towed away after Susan's strategic intervention. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus, her helicopter pilot. "County Aviation Board confirms your helipad documentation is ironclad." The pieces were falling into place. Wheeler was losing control. Janet Peterson, once his most loyal lieutenant, had begun to distance herself. The board meetings had become battlegrounds, with Michael Chen asking questions that made the older board members squirm. "This isn't just about a helicopter or a car," Susan had told Michael earlier. "This is about who gets to make the rules in a community." As the sun began to set over Pinewood Estates, Susan stood on her helipad, watching the neighborhood below. From this vantage point, the carefully manicured lawns looked like a chessboard, and she was about to make her most strategic move yet. The HOA had no idea what was coming. Sometimes revolution begins with a single person willing to stand up and say, "Enough." The emergency community meeting was called for 7 p.m. in the largest event space Pinewood Estates could muster. Susan arrived precisely at 6:55, her entrance a carefully choreographed moment of controlled power. The room buzzed with tension. Homeowners packed every available seat, the air thick with anticipation and long-suppressed frustration. Thomas Wheeler looked like a man who knew his kingdom was crumbling. Janet Peterson sat near the back, her once loyal demeanor now fractured. Michael Chen positioned himself strategically, a digital tablet at the ready, filled with forensic evidence that would make accountants weep. "The matter before us," Wheeler began, his voice cracking, "is the unauthorized aerial transportation infrastructure on Susan Hartley's property." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. But Susan knew this wasn't about a helipad. This was about control, about a small group of people who had weaponized bureaucracy for far too long. Richard Martinez stood up, his mathematics professor's precision cutting through the tension. "Let's discuss the actual numbers," he said, pulling out a meticulously prepared spreadsheet. "The financial discrepancies in our HOA's budget are not just concerning, they're potentially criminal." The room went silent. Susan had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a military campaign. Each piece was carefully placed. Michael's digital evidence, Richard's financial analysis, the growing support from homeowners who had long felt powerless. Wheeler's legal consultants from Chicago shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had prepared for a standard HOA dispute. This was something entirely different. "My helipad," Susan said, standing up, her voice carrying across the room, "is fully permitted, fully legal, and it represents something more than just a mode of transportation. It represents freedom, the freedom to move beyond the petty restrictions that have constrained this community." Smartphones emerged, recording every moment. This was no longer just a neighborhood meeting. It was a referendum on power. Michael Chen's tablet displayed a series of financial documents, each projection revealing layers of questionable spending. Maintenance contracts that never materialized, inflated invoices, strategic misallocation of community funds. "We have documentation," Michael announced, "of over $247,000 in unexplained expenditures over the past 3 years. The room erupted. Wheeler's face went from red to pale, then back to a mob of crimson. His legal team began whispering furiously, their confident demeanor evaporating like morning mist. Susan watched, her expression unchanged. This was chess, not checkers, and she had been planning this move for months. The HOA board's power was built on illusion, a carefully maintained facade of authority, and illusions, once exposed, crumble quickly. As the meeting descended into chaos, Susan caught Michael's eye. A slight nod passed between them. The first domino was about to fall. Within 48 hours, Thomas Wheeler resigned from the HOA board. Janet Peterson followed shortly after, her carefully compiled binders of complaints now nothing more than recycling fodder. The legal team from Chicago disappeared faster than free donuts at a police convention. Susan's dining room became command central. Spread across her immaculate white marble table were stacks of documents, encrypted communication devices, and a map of Pinewood estates that looked more like a military strategic planning session than a neighborhood improvement initiative. "We're not just changing the board," Susan explained to Michael Chen and Richard Martinez, who had become her most trusted allies. "We're restructuring the entire community governance." Richard's wife Elena brought in a tray of fresh empanadas, her contribution to what was becoming a neighborhood revolution. The smell of cilantro and slow-roasted pork mixed with the tension of strategic planning. Michael was mapping out a comprehensive digital infrastructure for community communication. No more hidden meetings, no more backroom deals. Transparency would be our new weapon. The county began a full investigation into the HOA's financial records. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Hidden accounts, kickback schemes, contracts awarded to friends and family without proper bidding processes. Susan's helicopter sat ready on its pad, a symbol of the freedom she represented. But this was about more than personal victory. This was about reclaiming community power from bureaucratic tyrants. "They thought blocking my driveway would stop me," Susan said, her steel-gray eyes scanning the documents. "They had no idea what was coming." Elena leaned in, her voice low. "The other neighborhoods are watching. If we succeed here, this could change how HOAs operate everywhere." The phone rang. There was a contact from the state attorney general's office. They wanted a full deposition, and Susan Hartley was exactly the witness they needed. Wheeler's world was collapsing. His wife had already filed for divorce, sensing the impending disaster. The country club membership was quietly being revoked. Social circles that once welcomed him now turned away. "This isn't about revenge," Susan told Michael and Richard. "This is about justice, about creating a community that works for everyone, not just a privileged few." Outside, her vintage Mercedes gleamed in the afternoon sun. The junkyard cars were long gone, towed away like relics of a failed regime. The first draft of the new community bylaws was taking shape. Transparent, fair, democratic. Susan Hartley had done more than win a battle. She had started a revolution.